Right, well, I suppose you've been welcomed, so I can just continue the welcome and introduce you to the topic tonight, which for me is agility in a fixed world. Now, it's not the greatest title, and Steve Wood did berate me slightly on this, but we made one amendment and I thought that's where we would stop for the evening. So, first of all, if you've got a phone in your pocket, then please, can I ask you to take it out of your pocket? Can I ask you to switch it on if it's off? Can I ask you to have the ringer on? Can I ask you to open up your Twitter app, your Facebook app? And if you want to send out negative or positive or any kind of thought about what I'm saying, please do so. You've seen this, I'm saying it again. This is an amazing, amazing event, this, and I think it's such an opportunity, and I really invite you, get involved, be part of the Durban community. It's not going to happen without you. Every single one of you has got something to add here, and before you know it, Steve Wood will have you up here as well. A shameless plug too is for Instruct channel. If you haven't been to an Instruct, go to the YouTube site and check it out. It's got a beautiful picture of a mature man that I think you could take the opportunity of enjoying. If you like today's talk, there's more. It's amazing. Get on there. So I didn't introduce myself. This is this slide. My name's Rory Clarke, and I'm very fortunate to be the partner of Chris Tite in a company called Kaleidocode. And if you want to contact me, if you're someone to suffer more punishment, please go ahead and use those details. A little bit about me. How did I get the opportunity to be up here? Well, frankly, I studied as a civil engineer, which eminently qualifies me for this particular role. And being an engineer, we love the idea of looking at fixed things. If it's not clear in black and white, we've normally got a problem with it. That's why we did engineering. And that's what I did until later on in my career, I got reborn as a phoenix and into software development. And from there, have worked through being a software developer, being a project manager, a team lead, you name it. Some say jack of all trades, I say master of all. But hey, the point being is that I know something about some of the foibles of having to deal in smaller companies and larger companies when it comes to software project management. And I felt this might qualify me, and Steve kind of encouraged me, so I went with that. So let me tell you something about myself. I love spaces, and I love openness, and I love balance. And one of the things I really love is photography that speaks to that. You know, when the exposure's right, and the colors are vibrant, and you can see some kind of detail that's hidden deeply in the picture. Well, that's my type of thing. And let me warn you, there are about 50 more of these to come. They have absolutely nothing to do with the talk. Don't look for inscrutable meaning, and there probably won't be a beer for you at the end if you choose to know where it is. But if you do know where the photograph is, please feel free to call out, because I probably don't know. Right. So something that's not a photograph, unless it's a photograph of a painting, is something about David and Goliath. And we're doing a lot of biblical mentions tonight, I've just got to say. So why this slide? Well, I wanted to start this story in terms of framing exactly what I'm raising tonight, which is agility in a fixed world. I had this checkered past of a career where I worked through a lot of companies, large and small, in the UK and locally, which worked on the traditional and correct method, waterfall. You all know and love it. It's when we knew what we were going to do at the beginning, and we damn well didn't get there at the end. And this story relates to my first project in a company here in sunny Durban on the Bluff, the epicenter of software development, you may say. And this relates to it's quite a small company, which I'll term the David, which is a company called Agrista, which had this very large, meaningful vision, which was we were going to change the future of agricultural finance. Stop yawning, it's important. We're eating it later. The point was, is that the software we were writing at the time was completely related to a Goliath. Because what we were doing is we needed the money. And the money in this form was a small little company known colloquially as ABSA Bank, the Goliath. And in our situation, we were bringing together our little baby, our amazing piece of software that we've been slaving away with in our own special way, which was Agile, it was Scrum, small teams, 2-week iterations. I know you've never heard of this before. It's so great being at SA Agile. It's just like the buzzwords are there. We all know what we're talking about. And yet, for the first time, we were going to take our baby and go and see Goliath, which in this instance was implementing the software within one of the big 4 banks. And I didn't realize I had to have this monotonic voice when I started out that project. It's only when you land at OR Tambo and transfer into the Silver Towers and you realize that things were going to go by a different beat. And the situation I got exposed to was, let me explain to you how we roll out software here, you young thing. We have 3 release dates a year. We planned them last year. Here are the dates. You can pick a date. If you miss your date, we'll see you next year. And if you're really lucky, because you have to book 6 months ahead, if you pick the first date in the year, you might get into the last if you miss it. And here I'm looking at this going, this doesn't sound particularly agile at all. And yet, being incredibly grateful and keen to be there, we knew we needed to make a plan. And it opened up a complete Pandora's box for us, is how was an agile team going to work within the constraints, probably needfully, though it didn't feel like it at the time, of a large commercial bank. And they explained why. It was security. It was, do you realize how many things will happen if this doesn't go right? How will we roll this back? A myriad of reasons. But for us, it really thrust us into the situation where we knew we had to take Agile and we had to meet fixed. Now, there's something about this that I realized through it, that we worked out a way of working that could live inside a controlled environment. But at the time, it just felt like it was the next natural thing to do. And one of the key things we realized quite early on is we got into a situation where we knew we weren't going to be able to do it ourselves. We realized early on, if we didn't have some people helping us from inside, we weren't probably going to make it. We needed a guide. We needed somebody who could make it work within the constraints of what we were going to face. And as we go through the rest of what I'm going to show you today, I'm going to draw you back to this one. But for us, and I dare say possibly for Chris as well, this was something where we realized that there was a way to remain true to ourselves and yet at the same time deliver software repeatedly. The outcome of this particular series of projects, which spanned probably in the region of 5 years, was every single release on time, every single scope metric hit, one of the best vendors in terms of speaking to the vendor management people that they had worked with, and from our perspective, an entirely delighted customer. Now, the funny thing about it is you still have to make the agricultural finance work. And accolades for software's sake are still just accolades. But there was something about this that we realized that there was a gold ring that we could push forward with. Whilst I say this, and me having the microphone per se, is I'm going to rob something from Chris and just say right out of the gate, this is just my experience. It probably doesn't work like this necessarily for you. Your mileage may vary, i.e. no silver bullets. And I'm merely putting out a few ideas, and I'm quite happy that you ask Chris hard questions about those ideas later. And so I know you're committing the next probably 30 minutes to me, and you've been very gracious thus far. I thought I would give you a skeleton so you know what to expect. And possibly the light is probably high enough you could get to your car and leave if you need to right now. So, having a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, I thought I would build you a skeleton. We're going to cover why I think fixed matters and why it matters to us Agilists. We're going to talk about estimation. Wait, what? Yes, estimation. It's unavoidable. We're going to cover scope versus size. And I'll explain what that means. We're going to talk about David updated. I'm going to bring you from 10 years ago to where we're doing projects now, and possibly what we're doing differently to how we mix agile with fixed. And the final thing is I'm going to give you a few takeaways. And they might look like that, but I'm hoping they might be a little bit more cerebral. We'll see how we go. So let's jump in. Why does fix actually matter? Now, for most of us, we probably go, well, that's pretty obvious. But the bottom line is this. Pretty much everything we do as software professionals is financed by someone. It could be a consumer. It's very often a business. And business needs to know what things cost and when they're going to be delivered. And we're the same if you think about it. How do you like that car mechanic who, when you open up the hood of your car, starts clucking? And you start going, I have no idea what he's going to say next. 30,000? The pause lingers. 40? What is this going to cost me? It's something intrinsic about us. We want to nail down what can't be nailed. And I don't think you're going to find it any different in software. People need to have some sort of idea of where they're going and what it's going to cost them. And the thing about it is, for most of us, we've got to put our foot down at some point. We've got to put down an estimate, because really without an estimate, there's no approval. There's really only trust that can be generated out of delivery. It's the age-old thing. I can tell you what the lotto numbers were last week, and nobody thinks that's special. It's the prediction of the lotto numbers that really has the impact. And estimates, in a way, are similar. It's about being able to say what you're going to do and do it. So the dreaded endless road. This represents, for me, the estimate. How long is it? Where does it end? And I think if you think about it, we should probably go to Webster's dictionary to sort of explain it. It's tentative. It's preliminary. It's just an opinion. Yes, for most people, if you think about it, an estimate is actually a guess. So, how many of you have been in this situation where you've been asked to estimate how long it's going to take? When really before anyone knows what it is. No idea. It's that thing with 3 stories and a door and a window and this and that and the next thing. But you'll be okay. You've done this before. How long will it take? It's absurd. Have you ever seen an estimate? This is just for some of the older people. The 25-year-olds probably won't see this. That kind of assumes that no one will go to training or attend meetings or be called to work on another project, God forbid, or need to support a key customer. Does that happen? Take a vacation? Get sick? God forbid, resign. And it happens all the time. So where does it leave us? I mean, if you think about it, if you look at any estimate, is the estimate not the person who's the loudest? Don't we believe in the one who's outspoken enough to say, that's exactly what it is? I'm 40, I know what I'm talking about. Well, have you been in this situation where developers say yes to impossible targets? And I mean amazingly impossible targets. Now, if you think about it, the developers actually are putting themselves in a position where it's actually incredibly difficult to be able to mount some kind of vigorous, plausible, job-risking defense of this estimate that was basically brought up and raised by the hunches of managers. Who said this? Well, this is Fred Brooks, the author of No Silver Bullets. Anybody know what the cone of uncertainty is? Again, older people, I'd like to see those hands. Thank you very much. Well, the cone of uncertainty basically specifies something along the lines of this, that we get asked how long something is going to take over here, where we're really early in the project. And actually, over time, we kind of understand a little bit more about what we're doing until we get to this sort of stage here, where it's done, where somebody can say, it's done, and the estimate's 100% correct. And the cone of uncertainty speaks to this narrowing of, as we get further, we obviously are going to get a better estimate. The thing about it, though, is that we get to be in a situation where we get forced to do commitments really early on in the process. So we tend to get commitments over here, and we don't actually get to recommit. I suppose it sounds like recommitting your vows, isn't it? But like, recommit as you get going down here. And why not? Because if you think about it, I know more, I can see more, and yet we often end up living in a world over here, even as Agilists. So what about working backwards on this? What about asking, what is it that I'm actually being asked to achieve? Are you really asking for an estimate, or do you really have an end in mind? So one of the key questions I think we need to ask is, when we ask for an estimate, are we actually meant to be figuring out how to get to a specific target, or is it just a figure? And generally speaking, let's say 100 times out of 100, there's a target. We'd like it by June. So let's go through the common case. And for those of you who've never been through this, you're lying. Starts off with, we'll call them the executive. We know the type. He comes in with, how long do you think this project will take? We need this by then for a trade show, meeting, presentation, the future of your job. And by the way, I can't give you really any more team members. You're going to have to do with what you've got, if you're lucky. And here's a list of features. We'd like these implemented, please. So you put yourself in the position, the sweaty project lead, going, what will I do now? You say something like really blah, like, let me crunch some numbers. I'll come back to you. Meanwhile, later, and you come back with this. We've estimated the project will take 5 months, not 3 months, 5 months. And what response do you get? 5 months? Didn't you hear me? Didn't I explain to you we need it done in 3? And we know where this goes. What happens if we had to refactor this, to choose another criticism? What happens if we had to take it a different way? What happens if we went, we'll start with the same executive, same question, how long? 3 months. No more. People, do it yourself. Here's a list. What happens if we went a slightly different way? What happens if our project lead was a little bit sparky, said something like, let me understand what you're saying here. Is it more important for us to deliver all those features, or is it more important we ship on time? Smart guy. Let's see what the response was. You're going to be used to this. Well, we have to be ready for the trade show. We'd like to have all the features. You know where this is going. But the response here could be a little bit different. I want to be sure I'm following in on what you're saying here. If it turns out we can't deliver all of them by the trade show, would you rather we ship with what we've got, or would you rather that we slip beyond the trade show? Hence the question. Tricky. What's the executive going to do? Well, we've got to have something for the trade show. Didn't expect that. Push comes to shove, we'll have to ship something, even if it's not 100% of what we want. Project lead, I'll come up with a plan for delivering as many of those features as I can. It's a totally different outcome. A few little different questions, a little bit of a different scenario. Now, there's nothing groundbreaking in this at all, is there, really? But a psychology, and possibly asking a few different questions. But it's led to quite a different outcome that, from my perspective, I would be a lot more comfortable if I was in this project lead's shoes. let's just pick up for a moment on one last thing. A lot of people will say, yeah, but let's do this properly. Let's fix the scope entirely so we know what we're going for, and let's really understand incredibly well. Let's just do an amazingly detailed specification. And we'll define it so incredibly well that we can do this amazing, amazing estimate. Well, we know that's not going to work. The reality is that you can't really over-engineering the fuzzy front end. That's why it's called the fuzzy front end. And the bottom line is this, that no amount of wishful thinking is going to make that estimate necessarily any clearer. So let's talk about that for a minute. How bad can this actually get? Well, let's think about estimation techniques. So let's say we've got probability on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we've got schedule or cost of effort, something like that. What's this going to cost me? If you start tracking the probabilities here, I hear you screaming normal distribution. Anybody? Anybody here? Yeah? We should have a bell curve, exactly, right at the back. Can I give away one of your beers? No. But the funny thing is if you look at software projects, it gets a little bit interesting at this point on the curve. Anybody want to hazard a guess where this goes? Something like that. Now this is statistically correct, as the scientists would tell you. And the bottom line is, if you look at the nominal outcome, we're talking about the median, the 50-50 outcome, it's not in the center. It's actually over here. And in fact, I'm being kind. I think it could be over here. The bottom line is, and this is critical to think through, there's a limit, asymptotic, as to how well a project can go. But there is no limit how badly it can go. Who's been there? Right, so what are we saying here? Are we saying that why estimate? I mean, we'll just estimate as we go. I mean, that would be great. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. And as a big Steve McConnell aficionado from the 90s, please tell me you know who I'm talking about, yeah. We're talking about like one of the key members of IEEE in America. Come on, I mean, we're talking about code complete. We're talking about rapid development. I mean, these are tombs. This is the legacy I was built on, is that he had amazing feeling for data and what actually does work in an estimation world. And there's no doubt that there is an element of being able to do excellent estimates that can be worked upon. It's a skill. It definitely is one. And it's something that we can incorporate in what we're doing. I'm not cutting across that. I'm really, really not tonight. But I do think it's something worth recapping as we launch forward. So one of the things Steve puts forward is if you can count, count it. In other words, bottom up is not bad. In fact, it's preferable where you can do it. If you can start working off something, then do that. It gets you to a figure. If you can't count it, try and do the best computation you can. And that could be on existing algorithms, existing patterns, whatever you can do to try and put an estimate forward. If you really, really have to work off gut feel, because gut feel is going to let you down a myriad of times. I'm sure we can do that in a week. That's 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. Easy. And one of the things he spoke about that I felt we've got value from is try and do historical comparison wherever you can. If you've got projects that are similar or there's similar features, there's something that you can hold on to, try and work within it. Try and take something from it, because it really does help calibrate your counting. And at the end of the day, we have to do estimates anyway. Somebody's looking for something at some point, hence the fixedness. So can we put Steve in the doghouse though? I mean, we're here at an Agile event. I mean, if I carried on the way I was going, I would probably get cremated. So what do we feel like Steve is possibly missing? I mean, one of the things we've really learned, it gets incredibly difficult for us to estimate until we've actually started doing something. And often projects are different. And if the technology is different, not different, the domain is starting to get different, or the people are starting to get different. And if you think about it, this is why we got into Agile in the first place. We're looking at trying to understand through an iteration if we've got something slightly less unknown, front-loading sprints with things we don't know, high risk. I mean, you've been all through this. This is the thing we're trying to do. But the bottom line is, I think psychologically we know that we plan by doing, and we can do better planning as we've done more. So back to the dilemma. It feels like I'm talking at cross purposes here. This is meant to be about agility in a fixed world. How on earth do we do that? What is an approach? So I've got one approach for you, and I'm not saying it's necessarily the right approach, and if you take exception, you heard what I said, Chris is sitting in the third row. But this is something I'd like to propose. Is it possible we could do a bit of a move from fixed scope in terms of what are all the features we're trying to do, and possibly to something like fixed size? Now, if you remember my clever project lead, is this not something that he did earlier? He framed it differently. He put the absolutes in place. He said, we've got so much time in this case. What can we do inside that? And he pushed effectively the business into the position where there was no other answer but to say, okay, I agree, we might need to go that way. So what does that look like? Let's look at the traditional. We all know the evil triangle. We've got either fixed scope or fixed cost or fixed time. And in a traditional contract, you would fix all three. But what if we took a different approach where we swapped out the scope for size? We still kept the cost, we still kept the time. Business is happy, right? To a degree. But we looked at what we could vary. So how would this look? How would you go about doing this? The steps could look a little bit like this. We still got to do an estimate. Probably not very good. But it's going to be the best we can do. We'll pull Steve out of the doghouse and we'll try and get something out there. We'll take that, and from that, we can at least fix an initial price and an initial time period, an initial duration, whatever you feel works for you. But from there, what happens if we committed? What happens if we agreed together that what we were going to look at is we were going to track how well we did, and we were going to check how much money we spent, disciplined, frequently. And what happens if we agreed we were going to embrace change? What happens if we felt, at shock and horror, we didn't actually know what the ultimate fixed scope was going to be? That we didn't actually know how long it would take us to do it? What happens if we did that, but up front, and we agreed together? Me and my exec. And what happens if we committed to earning each other's trust? That we were going to prove that to each other from each side. Trust is a funny thing. I don't know what you guys feel, but I'm not sure it's always present in software projects. I'm not always sure that the client doesn't feel like, jeepers, am I really getting it at the best price, or am I really getting it in the right timing, or is it really 40,000 rands worth of work on that engine? And the thing about that is often it's a lack of understanding, I feel, about how software is built, or what it takes to do, and that's me on my software developer shoes, or developers gold plating it and producing too much, and you're planning for the future. And there's this conversation that happens all the time, maybe not as explicit as that, but that's the reality of it. And I think at the end of the day, I think there's probably a misunderstanding on what actually scope is. What is scope? What are we actually trying to achieve? And if we put as much effort into what actually was the result we were looking for, we might well be able to embrace a little bit of change and possibly earn a little bit of trust by seeing the other side a little bit more. Now, this is becoming very psychoanalytical. When I put these slides together, I don't think this is where I was going. But anyway, let's see where we get going. So a bit of risk. So what we're really talking about here is this agile estimation. How do we do that change? How does that work together? Well, let's recap. Whoops, good gracious. Let's recap. We had an educated thumbsuck at the beginning. We got a budget. Presumably we got sign-off from someone that allowed us to start. We agreed the budget couldn't be exceeded. Did I say that? we agreed the budget couldn't be exceeded. Something had to give. And we started iterating aggressively on what the scope was and what the estimate of how long it was still going to take. Now, this is an interesting statement. And I think this is the thing that possibly unlocks it for me. Everybody know what a change request is? A VO. A SVO. They're all names for that piece of paper. Sometimes it's more than one piece of paper. When the software developer realizes he's not quite got it, or he's been asked for something he didn't have, out it comes. It's an additional feature. Oh, it's an extended feature. Oh, it's another one of those. It's another one of these. Once we rethought that, once we went to the VO and we called it something different. What happens if it is an exchange request? An exchange request. This sounds very Hugger Bunny stuff. Guys, get ready. It's going to get worse. What happens if it worked a little bit like this? What happens if we had a backlog with an estimate, with a plan, with features? I said we would. I've done my part. And what happens when we get to the end of that first sprint, or in normal cases, the end of the first day, and somebody says, we've got a new story. Now, I know this doesn't happen on your projects. This is just me. That's my opinion. But let's say it did happen. What would you do? I can tell you what would naturally happen. VO. And another block, Z, would drop in at the bottom, and we'd be shifting it right up to the top. Well, with Exchange, it works slightly differently. We do some interesting mathematics to work out the square area or size of the triangle. We look at what we've already got, and we decide whether we could make a swap. The idea being that, in this case, poor old C and D lose their way to be quietly strangled in a dark alley, and Z takes their place. It's still fixed, it's still on the budget, it's still coming in on time. Now you go, that's great. But how does that actually work out? Lovely theory. Well, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about where we've had an opportunity to try this out. So if you can bear with me, and I have no idea where we are for time, but you're here, so you're going to have to stick with me. And I'm going to do the first one, and I'm delighted that I have somebody here who can tell me if I've got it wrong. So the first one is with a company locally that we did work with called Adapt-IT. And this particular project was an interesting project. It was interesting in that it is cool technology, it was a nice product idea, but it already existed. All the features were already there. It had a V1 and had been used for years. The customers knew it, they knew how it worked. It was all in place. We were in a position where we were given the task to rewrite it. Now, how would that work? Effectively, we were given an existing product and said, you can look at it in as much detail as you like, and you can see what it does in every single facet, and you can jump in and give us an estimate. The words that struck terror into the heart of anybody who has had to make estimates. The thing about that, if you've ever been involved in that, is you have no idea what's sitting actually under the hood, really necessarily. And the lovely thing about existing products is the customers know how it works. And they will tell you when your new version does not. So there's a bit of trepidation that we entered into this to say, well, how would we actually go and estimate this? And to be quite honest, I put on my black hat. There was chanting, you know, you name it. We pulled Steve McConnell out of the dog box. We figured it out our best ways, our comparisons. Is this a little bit like that? Is she a little bit? Yes. Hey? Yes. Or I think that 3 weeks. And we times it all up, did our best bottom up, and we got a figure. Now, I'd like to think it is an amazing figure. I can see in your faces you think it is an amazing figure. But quite honestly, it could have been 100 grand more, it could have been 100 grand less, and nobody would have told me, certainly not the client, that I was wrong. Maybe 100 grand less, they would have said I'd been more right. But the bottom line is we had a starting point. And from there, we had to enter into how was this going to progress. Now, the interesting thing for the client in this case is that they needed it done by a certain date. And that's because, like in most companies, somebody's had to promise something to someone at some stage to get it sold. And the reality is, it's often us that have to come in to make the promise good. Hence the 3 months. So what do we end up doing in this instance? Is a bit of a tricky situation. This was a company we'd never worked for before. There's an existing product. We now have a fixed price. How do we get into this thing? What do we do? And I'm not going to say that this was anything other than a team effort, especially since Natasha's here. But the bottom line is there was something about the group of people that sat around this project that I think intrinsically got this idea that we were working together on trying to deliver something, that we needed to be able to ship no matter what, that we had to produce something of value in a fixed world. And yet I've got this amazing agile team. They're having to live with this estimate. What are we going to do? Well, interestingly, at the time, the client is going through this whole agile process themselves, and so it's this natural fit. We're having this conversation. This is how I do agile. This is how I do agile. What do you do here? Oh, we like doing this. It is this amazing love story. And one could see how the honeymoon would end quite rapidly if we weren't actually delivering software. But it meant we could start off right from the start saying, we're doing 5 sprints. We're going to deliver like this. This is the scope we're going to do after sprint 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it was a natural conversation. And that certainly helped. But there was something else that was deeper than that. I think there was a conversation right at the start, tell me if I'm wrong, is that where we actually said, listen guys, we may have got the estimate wrong. We know we can't change the timing. But we are going to work together on looking at each feature as we go after each sprint and figure out whether we're more right or more wrong. And we're going to have these exchange discussions all the way through. And testament to them, probably foolhardy, they agreed. Possibly it was the deadline, but I'd like to think it's because they saw value in it. And so that's what we ended up doing. We had, in this instance, a colossal spreadsheet, really high-tech PM, with all the estimates. And merely what we did is every time we discovered something, and this wasn't necessarily at the end of every sprint, it was often at the end of every day, that we would actually sit together where possibly the client might say, I've had this wonderful new idea for a feature, enter Z. And we would be going, where do you think C and D could go and die? And that was a difficult conversation at first, I think. It was a little bit like, well, we don't want anyone dying. No one's left behind here. And from our perspective, it just wasn't going to work. But we had them frequently. I think people got into the pattern of it. And I must say, probably about sprint 2 or 3, it's kind of like we were used to this. Now, there was more complicated things involved in here. On the client side, they're juggling 10, 15 projects, possibly more, and they're trying to work out their features as they go through the project. So the reality was, we had Zs coming through often, and to almost the end. And I think the nature of it was that because we'd got so used to swapping Cs and Ds and Zs, is it actually ended up working quite well. Now, what I'm not going to say to you is, they all rode necessary happily into the sunset, and the sun set and it's a warmy go. Sometimes it is difficult. Sometimes we were saying no, probably a bit too hard. Sometimes the client was saying, I'd really, really, really want this. And it is testament to both sides that we could try and find the compromise in the middle. So what really were key things there? Fixed budget, fixed deadline, common goals, ability to work together, knowing from the start we were going to try and work together, knowing from the start we were going to do exchange requests. And I suppose for me, one of the biggest things I saw out of it was discipline. The discipline to continue estimating, the discipline to keep having the meetings, the discipline to keep on looking at the scope and trying to figure out where we were going to find the gap. And there was compromise, I can tell you, on both sides. But, and this is the glamour shot, project out on time, customer delighted, hope they've paid. I think basically something that was described internally in the organization as a successful product. We've done additional work on it since. So from my perspective, selfishly, it's been a great outcome. But I think at the end of the day, it was on both sides. I have no idea where I am in terms of timing, but I'm going to keep on talking.
You got about a minute.
Okay. So you'll be relieved to know that my prompter says I've got 4 slides left. This one I'll do a little bit more quickly because you get the gist. This one is Sage Advice. Now, Sage Intelligence is a local company that operates out of Mhlongo, and they had approached us to do another project. Except this time, it wasn't MVC, it wasn't database work here, it wasn't enterprise service bus there. It is something we had never, ever done before. Imagine Excel on steroids, doing things unnaturally that it shouldn't probably ever in public be found doing. And this is where we enter. And with that plucky, yes, we'd love the work type of attitude, we said, of course, we'd love to. Guess where we started? Estimate. And guess where the second conversation came? We're not sure our estimate's right. However, we would love the opportunity to be able to exchange ideas with you as we go through. Again, amazing client, amazing desire to see it work, really helped, and that was a commonality. But there was something different about this project. It was something we really had no benchmark for. And it is something that we knew had a fixed budget again. And it ended up being something where we really had to push the envelope far further than we had in the previous example. It was something where we had to actually have far more open conversations in far more detail about not being sure exactly where we were going to end up. And in that instance, I think for me, I really realized that what this is really, really based on is that trust element that we spoke about a little bit before. Now, this sounds very bunny-huggy, and we've probably a minute gone. But I think there's an essence in terms of takeaways that I think one really wants to get out of this that for me really made an impact. The first is this. If you don't prioritize your work, your scope, your backlog, whatever your lingua franca is for that thing, you're incredibly going to battle applying this type of technique. Because when you're exchanging scope and when you're assessing it, you have to have something where you know you're willing to let that one die in the alley. And it's something about exploring that scope, not just understanding the business domain, but understanding for the customer what they think is actually important and what they think is not. Because often they don't know. The second one is when it gets into research and development, when it gets into high-risk areas, this is a very, very tricky technique. And one would almost say that often people wouldn't want to touch it. We've had one angle on this that really worked for us, though, and I think it's worth bearing in mind. We went and did a T&M to fixed project. We did these are the really risky parts that would push your estimate way up, and we agreed corporately we'd do a little bit of exploration on it on a non-risk basis before we got into fixed. And that worked quite well, something to think about. And then the third sort of hug a tree type of, but last slide, is this. Why is it that there's so little trust in IT? What is it the things that I spoke about before that are preventing us from working in this manner? And I think a lot of it has got to do with we have this legacy of failed projects, that asymptotic kind of curve that reaches out to the right has actually scarred us a little bit. We don't really know it, but I think it's actually there. And so there's a deep degree of skepticism often when we're doing estimates or whether we're receiving them. And yet we've got to persevere with this. And there's something that Chris talks about that I think really makes a great big impact to me. If we're really going to be looking for authentic relationships and trust, we have to develop something called WISPs. And WISPs are the thing, and I'll probably describe this poorly, but it's got something to do with those little things that we do that generate trust with each other. Client, developer, senior developer, architect, it doesn't really matter. It's the little talks, it's the putting the effort into trying to be quite frank and open about a situation, telling it as it is as often as you can, and getting it out there. It is exposing, but I think it's the only way you're going to be able to work on this type of exchange basis. And I think you've got to be long term. I think if you're in it for the short term, if you're in it to get in and out, I don't think it's going to work out. Because there's something about the second interaction or the third interaction or the fourth, which could be over multiple years, that only gets better and more trustworthy as you proceed. And I think there's something else about long term. For a lot of the people that I know that I've worked with delivering them software, is they didn't really necessarily know software. They weren't the BA or the PM or this or the next thing. It is the business stakeholder. It is the exec. It is the guy at the top, or is the product owner. And it is their first software product or their second. And they didn't really quite get it right the first time. So they're carrying some baggage. There's something about long term where we need to develop trust. And I think we need to see it that way. And you know what that often means? Maybe it's a little bit less profitable. Maybe we took a bit of a bath on that one. Maybe it's worth giving them the extra mile. Maybe we wanted to give that exchange cost back, and we really would have liked to charge them, but we're not going to do it this time. There's something about that I think for us, we've seen pay off in spades, and I'd really heartily recommend it. And on that, I leave you with a beautiful bridge, and possibly the only slide that I put some kind of tagline on, just because I think somebody was going to ask, where is that? It's somewhere between Denmark and Sweden, and if you can really see, a hand in the back, there you have it. So with that, thank you very much.